Hey everyone, this is Mike, and today I'm going to be doing the level 80 overview of the Paladin. Paladin didn't change a whole lot going into Shadowbringers, but there were some small tweaks made to their rotation that make it a little bit more fun to play. Paladin's always been kind of my least favorite tank to play back in Heavensward and Stormblood. In Stormblood mainly because it had cost times, which in a tank I didn't really enjoy, but now going into Shadowbringers they did touch upon some of these issues that I had with the job, and they just made it better overall. Some small things, quality of life, also some small changes to the gameplay which make it more interesting. So Paladin is a pretty simple and straightforward job. You have just about a 1 minute rotation in which you're cycling through 2 buffs and a cooldown phase, I guess you could say. So you start off with your physical damage buff called Fight or Flight, then once that's over you go into your magical damage phase underneath the buff Requiescat, and then you have a small phase in your rotation where you don't have a damage buff active, and then you basically restart over. Now, all of your damage buffs are on a 60-second cooldown, but the Paladin's rotation is actually 62 seconds long. The reason for that is because you basically have 1 GCD too much in your 60-second rotation, so that's why it becomes 62-63 seconds, depending on your GCD. There's 2 ways what you can do. So either you can decide to cut 1 GCD in your rotation so that you're staying aligned with all of the raid buffs, or you basically just keep all of your GCDs in the rotation, but then you will slowly over time become unsynced with the raid buffs of your team. In general, I've heard that it's better to unsync yourself to keep all of your GCDs in the rotation than it is to than to keep yourself synced and lose that one. So in general, I'm going to be using the 62-second rotation. It's also what I will be showing in the video, so I recommend you do the same, as that is kind of like its basic flow of Paladin. So let's take a closer look at all of the skills that we have available. So first of all, when it comes to our physical damage portion of our rotation, we have basically 3 combos, you could say. 2 of our combos will start off with the Fast Blade into Riot Blade combo. Riot Blade will also refund you MP, which is really important because you need MP in order to go into your magical phase. We have Royal Authority, which will deal damage, just straight up damage, but it will also grant you 3 stacks of Sword Oath, which you can spend those stacks on Atonement. So your basic physical combo will kind of look like this, and I'll also use my Fight or Flight buff to show you just how long it lasts. So after the first GCD we can use our Fight or Flight. We use our Goring Blade so that our dots start sticking. We use our Royal Authority buff, or attack, and then we can use 3 Atonements, which our Atonements will also regenerate MP, which is pretty important. And then as you can see, just before our dot falls off and our Fight or Flight ends, we can do 1 last Goring Blade, thus ending our physical damage portion of the rotation. Now, once this is done, we go over to the Requiescat phase of our rotation, I guess you could say, in which we'll be spamming Holy Spirits and using Confiator as a combo finisher. What's really important about Requiescat is that you will only get the damage increase and the instant cast times when you're above 80% MP. So this is why it's important that you use these like Riot Blade, Atonements, and even like your AoE combo will also regenerate MP, because if you're not above 80% MP, you basically won't get anything from Requiescat. So that's also a reason why you don't use your magical attacks outside of the Requiescat buff, because 1, they do less damage, and 2, it might make it so that you don't have enough MP to actually make use of this buff. So outside of this buff, I'm gonna show real quick. As you can see, I have cast times with my Holy Spirit. I'm very quickly gonna generate some MP again. So now I have enough MP. Now if I use Requiescat, you can see that now I can move around and I don't have cast times on my abilities, and of course like I have ranged attack, so this is good if it overlaps with some like ranged buff phase where you need to run away. And then you basically finish the Requiescat phase with your Confiator. Now when it comes to AoE is also pretty simple. We have Total Eclipse into Prominence for our physical part. Of course, Prominence also restores MP, which is really important. And then when it comes to our magical portion of our AoE, we have Holy Circle. Again, this has a cast time, but underneath the Requiescat buff, it is a free, or like an instant cast as well. And that's pretty much the general rotation of Paladin. It's pretty straightforward, it's pretty simple. It also does not interact with your gauge at all. Your gauge is purely for defensive cooldowns. I'm very quickly just gonna regenerate some mana so that I can show off the 1 minute rotation. But yeah, so your gauge does not interact with your rotation at all, so you don't have to worry about like having enough gauge to spend on certain actions like you would with Warrior or Dark Knight or something like that. So Paladin is pretty straightforward, and its rotation will always stay the same as well. So I'm gonna quickly spend my 3 atonement stacks so that I have all of my mana back, and there we go. So when starting a fight, you're generally going to start with fight or flight, as that is the biggest burst portion of your rotation, as it also affects your auto attacks, and auto attacks deal a lot of damage. So start with 1, we use our fight or flight. We also have 2 off GCDs that we can use. One is a single target GCD called Spirits Within. One is an AoE attack called Circle of Scorn, and it's an AoE damage over time effect. And we also have a Gap Closer, which you can use during this buff as well, because it's physical damage. Then, as our buff is about to run out, again we refresh our Goring Blade, and then we go into our Requiescat, through which you have like some more movement, I guess, and if you like need to run away from a boss, you can do that or something like that. Finish it off with Confiator, and then we go back into our Riot Blade. As you can see, the dot is about to drop, so we use it again, and then we just use another Royal Authority and 3 atonements. Now this is where you could skip 1 atonement if you want, so that you can immediately use your fight or flight again when it comes up, but in general we just like use that 1 extra GCD so that we can get back into it a bit later and just get all of the potency out of it. And that's pretty much the whole Paladin rotation. It's pretty simple, it's pretty straightforward, and it just repeats itself for like the whole fight. No, I actually accidentally didn't use my atonement there. But yeah, so that's the Paladin rotation. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It doesn't change either. The only small thing that you could do is like skip atonements or something like that to keep aligned with the buffs of the raid as well. But other than that, it's pretty simple, it's pretty straightforward. Now, when it comes to Paladin's defensive kit, it is a very, it's a bit different than the other tanks. So when I was talking about Gunbreaker and Warrior specifically, I always said that Gunbreaker is a nice middle ground in between Paladin and in between Paladin and Warrior, because Warrior is so focused on its personal defensive cooldowns and doesn't have as much for the party, but Paladin has a lot for the party, but doesn't have that great personal mitigation. Now, you might be saying, well, Paladin has Hallowed Ground, and which is generally considered to be the strongest personal cooldown that you can have, but its big drawback is that it has an insanely long cooldown. So you kind of want to look at it as, what is more valuable for you? Is it more valuable to have a Warrior who can maybe use his home gang 2 or even 3 times in a fight, or would you rather have a Paladin who can use their cooldown maybe once or maybe twice a fight, depending on like your kill time and such? Because generally you won't get more than 2 usages out of Hallowed Ground. Sometimes you won't even get more than 1 out of it, depending on where you use it. So you kind of want to like look at those 2 factors and be like, do I want to have my invuln available more often, or do I want to just have a really strong invuln available for only once or maybe 2 portions of the fight? So that's kind of like the decision you have to make there when considering if you want to take a Paladin or not. Of course, in longer fights, Paladin can be extremely valuable. Look at Titan, for example. A Paladin being able to use Hallowed Ground in the 3rd phase for the Tank Buster is really valuable over something like a Warrior or a Dark Knight, or even a Gunbreaker, because those all require healing in order to like not die in the end. Whereas Paladin can just be like, okay, healers, you can focus on healing the party, because the 3rd phase of Titan is very healing intensive, so that's where a Paladin shines. But on some other parts where you don't really need your Benediction, for example on the White Mage, or where the healing is not as stressful, it might be better to just be able to use your ultimate cooldown once or twice more than you would be able to on a Paladin. So when it comes to the personal mitigation of Paladin, we only have 3 skills. We have Rampart, which every tank has access to, and as a 2-minute 30% mitigation, we have Sentinel. Every tank kind of has their own alternative as well. Their own spammable cooldown is called Sheltron. Now, Sheltron is a bit different than the other tanks because it is very spammable to an extent. So, Sheltron is one of the abilities that uses your Oath Gauge. And basically what it does, it blocks all incoming attacks for 6 seconds. This is both physical as well as magical. Now, because it costs 50 Oath Gauge and only has a 5-second cooldown, it means that if you have a 100 gauge, you can basically use this twice in a row, effectively giving you 12 seconds of cooldown, which is really good. Because it means that you can use it for longer periods of time, or you can use it very quickly back to back for 2 different tank busters. So that's why Sheltron is pretty good. It also blocks both physical and magical. This was changed back in Stormblood, because back in Heavensward it only used to block physical, but because it is so multi-purpose now, Sheltron is really good. And a block just about averages out to about 20% cooldown. So it's pretty good. Then there are 2 other things that we can do with our Oath Gauge, but they are not for personal mitigation, they are for party mitigation. First of all, the best way to use it is on Intervention. This is your main tank helping out cooldown. This will reduce the damage taken by 10%, but as a bonus, you can also share half of the effect of your Rampart or your Sentinel to that other tank or that other party member. This makes Intervention really valuable when it comes to something like E2S, because in E2 Savage both of the tanks will always be sharing tank busters. So basically say that for each tank buster you either have Rampart Sheltron, and then for the second one you have Sentinel Sheltron, for example. You'll always be able to share half of that Rampart or half of that Sentinel with your co-tank, thus making both of you a lot stronger. So Intervention definitely a really good cooldown. Now, changed in Shadowbringers is Cover. Cover used to be just a cooldown that would also reduce the damage taken by 20% of the party member that you would cover. But right now it's tied to your Oath Gauge, and it doesn't have the damage reduction anymore. Basically how Cover works is you give it to a party member, and as long as you're close enough to that party member, you will be taking all of the damage that they would receive, meaning that you can basically take a tank buster for somebody else when you're in the off-tank position. This used to be really valuable back in Stormblood because there was also 20% mitigation tied in this Cover, so you could basically use Cover as a cooldown on itself. But right now the 20% mitigation is gone, so I personally think that Cover is kind of worthless at the moment. It's not that good unless maybe it's like a party member missed a heal or something, so you quickly cover them so they die. They don't die to a rate wide AoE or something like that. But when it comes to like planning in between, like for sharing tank busters and such, it's much better to just tank swap, because tank swapping has been made even easier. It's not just tied to like, oh, do I have Shirk, yes or no. If you swap without the Shirk, the other tank just needs to turn off their tank stance and you're good to go as well. So Cover lost a lot of its value going into Shadowbringers, but on the other hand, like, the tanks can tank swap so easy anyways, so it doesn't really matter that much. And then of course, last but not least, you have Hallowed Ground, but Hallowed Ground is kind of meh. I personally am not a huge fan of it because it has a giant cooldown, but it does have a extremely strong effect, so in certain fights I can definitely see why you would prefer having Hallowed Ground over something like a Home Gang or something like a Living Dead. Now, other than that, because as I said, Paladin does have the most party utility out of all of the tanks, we have not 1, but 2 party-wide mitigations. So first of all, we have Divine Veil. Now this is a little bit different than the other tanks because it requires healing. So what it does is it places a 30-second buff on yourself, and when you get healed, the Divine Veil gets procced, and you basically give a 10% HP shield to the whole party except yourself. You never get access to this shield, which is kind of unfortunate. So 2 ways you can proc this is you use it on yourself and then one of your healers heals you to proc the shield, or alternatively you can use Clemency on yourself, which is something that you technically never want to do, but it is there. So that's your first mitigation. Second mitigation part is a 15% flat mitigation of just damage received. This is also something that you will need to hold. So as long as you're using your passage of arms, you can't attack. So you basically don't want to be using this too much when the boss is hittable, or like when you can hit the boss, I guess. But what you can do is kind of like with Astrologian's Collective Unconsciousness, is quickly press it as an off GCD and then release it again, because the effect of the passage of arms will linger for about 5 seconds. So if it's just to mitigate a single hit, then you can just use it really quickly, like for 1 second or something, just use it as an off GCD and weave it in between your GCDs, and then your party will still get this effect if you time it right. Now, of course, if you want to mitigate, let's say 10 seconds or something of damage, then you will need to hold the ability and lose the DPS, but that is something for you to decide in that moment. As a bonus, you will also block all of the incoming damage for yourself, so you could technically even use this as a tank buster mitigation thing for when you ran out of cooldowns or something like that. And then, of course, last but not least, you have Clemency. This is a heal that you can cast on both yourself or a party member. In general, you do not want to use this at all, because it does 2 things for you. 1, it costs mana to use, which you want your mana so that Requiescat works, and also so that you can use all of your Holy Spirits and your Confiator during your magic phase. 2, it costs a GCD, so it's not free in that regard either. When you look at something like Gunbreaker's Aurora or Warrior's Equilibrium, those are both free heals. They're off GCDs and they don't cost you any resources. Whereas Clemency costs you a resource and it costs you a GCD. And on top of that, it will also break your combo. So if you're in the middle of a combo and you Clemency somebody or yourself, then the combo will break as well. So Clemency is really bad when it comes to being like useful in a fight, I guess you could say, like in a normal fight scenario. But say, for example, both of your healers died and your red mage is busy resurrecting your healers, then you can use Clemency to save yourself and maybe your main tank or something like that, just to keep the tanks alive until the healers are up again, something like that. But in a normal scenario, you wouldn't really be using Clemency, as healing is the healer's job. So with all of that being said, that kind of covers everything about the Paladin. It's a pretty simple, pretty straightforward job. It might be a little bit lacking in the personal mitigation department, but it definitely makes up for that in everything it can do for the rest of the party. It's also probably the easiest tank to play, so if you're somebody that is looking to get into tanking, Paladin might just be the one for you. So with all of that being said, I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.